Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving right into the deep end of one of the most complex, high-stakes, strategic rivalries on the planet, China and India. We're going straight to the geopolitical data, the history, and our expert sources to critically examine what is actually happening at the highest levels of strategy in Asia.
Let's kick this off with a question that frames everything we're looking at today. What if the biggest threat isn't a single border? Think about that for a second. What if China's real leverage over India isn't just about massing troops up in the freezing Himalayas, but rather a slow, deliberate strategy to completely box India in from all sides? What if India's ultimate security challenge is an entire regional environment being engineered to constrain it?
To unpack that, we'll follow 5 steps today. We're going to start with the grand strategic chessboard, move to the continental land threat, explore the maritime cordon, look at India's Indo-Pacific countermove, and finally, weigh up the ultimate strategic balance.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the grand strategic chessboard.
You know, when you really look at these two civilizational states, they're operating from completely different playbooks. It's a classic matchup, the continental heavyweight versus the emerging maritime power. China comes to the table with massive continental reach, a deep industrial and military capacity, and this incredibly dense network of regional partnerships. India, on the flip side, is playing a different hand. They've got this prime maritime geographic position, a booming economy, and they're stepping up big time in the broader Indo-Pacific. This fundamental difference totally forces India to split its attention and operate across 2 entirely different theaters at the exact same time.
Which brings us to part 2, the continental land threat.
Let's zoom in on that harsh, high-altitude reality. The absolute crux of this is the LAC, or the line of actual control. Basically, this is the unresolved, heavily contested land frontier up in the Himalayas. And here's the kicker. Because it's not a settled, legally demarcated boundary, both sides have totally different ideas of where the line actually sits, based on historical claims. That ambiguity, it's a recipe for constant, simmering tension. Literally, a routine patrol movement can accidentally trigger a massive geopolitical standoff. We're talking about 2 nuclear-armed giants constantly balancing on a knife's edge here.
But here's the thing. The sources highlight that Beijing isn't really looking for an all-out open war. Instead, they use a strategy of incremental pressure. It's very step-by-step. They build permanent infrastructure right on the border, they push military assets forward, they switch up their patrol patterns, and they apply selective escalation whenever broader political relations get tense. It's kind of like a giant game of geopolitical Jenga. The whole point is to slowly change the facts on the ground without ever crossing the threshold into total conflict, which basically keeps India stuck in this exhausting permanent reaction mode.
If we pull back for a second, you can see this continental pressure is built on 3 main pillars. First, like we just talked about, the murky reality of the LAC. Second, the Tibetan Plateau. Tibet is absolutely vital because it gives China this massive high-altitude military advantage and a ton of leverage over water resources and mobility. It's essentially a giant forward operating base. And third, Pakistan. That deep strategic partnership between Beijing and Islamabad acts as a forward anchor for China. What it does is turn a single northern border issue into a deeply dangerous 2-front challenge for New Delhi. So between the LAC, Tibet, and Pakistan, India is basically staring at a dense wall of pressure on both its northern and western fronts.
Now let's shift gears to part 3, the maritime cordon.
What happens when that pressure spills off the land and into the surrounding seas? Well, it completely redefines what modern encirclement actually looks like. As the sources put it so perfectly, power today is not only about armies, it is also about access, ports, trade routes, elite relationships, and regional dependence. Encirclement isn't just troops physically surrounding your borders anymore, it's a strategic squeeze. If a rival can influence the countries all around your periphery, they can severely limit your choices without ever firing a single shot.
And China has been incredibly methodical about this, building what analysts refer to as a cordon of friends across the Indian Ocean and South Asia. Look at how they do it. Infrastructure and port investments plant Beijing's flag right in India's strategic backyard. Arms sales and military cooperation mean a land crisis could instantly spill over into the maritime domain. And their diplomatic outreach creates a web of relationships that subtly but surely hems India in. It acts as this quiet, persistent external constraint that's always in the background. And that brings us to a huge realization about the Indian Ocean. India isn't just defending physical territory anymore. They are defending movement, energy security, trade routes, and frankly, maritime confidence. The geopolitical playing field has expanded massively, and simply drawing lines on a map,
That's just not going to cut it anymore to secure the nation's future against this broader strategic pressure.
So how is India fighting back? Let's get into part 4, the Indo-Pacific countermove.
To avoid getting totally boxed in, India is pivoting outward in a major way. We are witnessing a fundamental rewrite of their grand strategy. For decades, India was pretty much glued to continental defense because, well, Pakistan and China were right there at the doorstep. But now, they're moving past pure continental defense. They're building these dynamic multipolar partnerships, like the Quad, and projecting influence all across the wider maritime zone, stretching all the way from the east coast of Africa straight into the Western Pacific.
And make no mistake, India brings some heavy hitters to the table for this. We're talking about a rapidly expanding economy, a massive modernizing military force, and honestly, an unbelievably strategic location smack in the middle of the Indian Ocean. By ramping up expanding naval partnerships and logistics agreements, India is locking in its role as a legitimate regional balancing power. These aren't just defensive moves. These assets let India actively shape the external strategic environment. They're not just reacting to Beijing anymore. They are building their own network of leverage.
But hang on a second. We really need to pause and ask a tough question here. Does a maritime strategy actually solve a continental border problem? I mean, as powerful as the Quad is, and as great as these naval agreements are, can ships, sea lanes, and distant allies truly offset the glaring vulnerability of a contested Himalayan land frontier? It's a massive dilemma.
Which perfectly sets up our final section, Part 5, the final strategic balance.
When you tally the balance sheet, our sources remind us we have to look at the whole picture impartially. India has incredible maritime momentum. Their Indian Ocean centrality, multipolar legitimacy, and strong external maritime partnerships are top-tier capabilities. But the limitations are very real. They're dealing with uneven military modernization, a ridiculously harsh border geography that is an absolute nightmare for logistics, and seriously stretched strategic bandwidth from trying to manage both Pakistan and China at the exact same time.
And that brings us to a really crucial takeaway from the research. Check this out. The rivalry is not about one side being entirely dominant. It is about which side can better shape the regional order around itself. Because China's strategy is so fluidly shifting pressure between borders, neighbors, economics, and sea lanes as needed, this isn't a winner-take-all scenario. It is a persistent, long-term contest for influence.
If you distill everything we've talked about today down to its absolute core, this is the ultimate dynamic defining the Asian geopolitical theater right now. China creates multiple pressure points. India creates multiple partnerships. So I'm going to leave you with this final question to chew on. Can India truly integrate its continental resilience with its growing maritime ambition to reshape the balance of power? Or, at the end of the day, is it merely responding to being encircled? As the strategic chessboard keeps evolving, will India's multipolar ocean strategy be enough to hold back the continental tide? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.